It's really my true pleasure today to moderate today's discussion with some people that I really deeply admire. And just a little bit about this sort of event and this the DSN. This event is part of a collaboration called the Digital Service Network, which is a really growing peer learning network that connects and supports digital services teams in government so that we can make government more responsive, open, and accessible. And the DSN is supported by both the Beck Center for Social Impact and Innovation at Georgetown University and USDR. And what we're really here to do is to share stories and experiences about government digital services, and today's event will reflect that. And today's event is really sort of one type of event we will do at DSN. In this particular one, we have only included public servants to participate because we really want to create that safe space for open discussion. And we really feel it's important to provide those spaces where public servants can really openly talk about the challenges that we're sort of all facing. So today we will walk you through the evolution of the San Francisco Digital Services team and sort of how their work has continued during, from day one, learning about how it got started, and then continued during team transitions, leadership changes, and lots of competing priorities, which I'm sure you can all empathize with in your own jurisdictions. And so we really specially curated this event so it's a place where we can come together and really talk about the realities of this work that we all do. And so in that vein, we also have a few requests of you. So just first, as I'm sure you all will, remember and respect that this is a safe space. We want our speakers to be able to be open and share, and it's really for learning and connections. And so we would ask that there's no tweeting during this event. And we really want this to be engaging and interactive. So please ask questions, use the chat box to ask as the presentation comes along, and then we'll invite you to come off mute when prompted. And we will be sharing out a sort of a recap of this conversation on digitalservicenetwork.org. But without further ado, let's get started. I am so pleased to be welcoming three amazing speakers today. First, we have Carrie Bishop, who was the former Chief Digital Services Officer of the City and County of San Francisco, and is now a current MBA candidate at Stanford. We have Sid Harrell, who is the current Chief Digital Services Officer at the City of County in San Francisco, and has many of you have probably read her book, so she'll be a familiar face or a familiar name for many of you. And then finally, we have Matthias Jaime, who is currently the Deputy Secretary of Technology and Innovation at the California Government Operations Agency, and in his former role as the director of the Committee on Information Technology at the city, was part of the foundation of kind of creating that team. And I don't know if I introduced myself, I'm Krista Canellakis, currently at USDR, but previously the Chief Innovation Officer, and so was involved at some of this origin story as well. So very excited to be pulling the threads that I know happened throughout this journey. So with that, I would love, Matthias, if you could sort of start us out with how did this all get started? What was kind of the origin story for this, and how did you build buy-in for getting this work going?
Well, thanks for having me here. And I'm really happy to see a lot of people, familiar faces in the audience too. And more than happy to share this story because I think Carrie and Sid have heard me talk about it quite a bit. It's something that I'm very proud about my time in San Francisco of getting it done. But I do want to say I'm flattered that I was asked to do it, but it was very much a team effort. Krista, Joy, a number of people who are still in the city were part of every step of the way. And so I just I think it's one of the unique features of San Francisco's digital services origin story, that it really was a collaborative effort to define what was needed and what the team was going. And I just happened to have a role in it in terms of my position in the city at that time. So at that time, I was the COIT director, or at least I was working at the Committee on Information Technology, COIT, which is San Francisco's technology governance body. And I had 3 different responsibilities in terms of strategic planning for the city. It has an annual budget role. So all technology projects went through COIT, and it also has a policy role. And so basically what I was describing was I'm a very much the bureaucracy side. So if you're reading the Hack Your Bureaucracy book right now, that's kind of how I fit into this dialogue. And at the beginning, when I started this job, we had this responsibility to do a technology strategy for the city every 2 years. And so when I started, that was where this whole story began. We had brought together different CIOs, different kind of leadership across the city, start talking about what were the problems for San Francisco and what do we need to go forward with. And I will say, when it comes to strategic planning, I am very aware that a lot of strategic plans that organizations put forward, and especially government, they often become shelfware. It's just something that is done because it's a compliance requirement. And I've learned a lot because now I've done a lot of strategies, both doing it at the city level and now at the state. But this is an instance where I learned a lot about how to make effective strategy and really lead it to something that's going to lead to tangible outcomes. And part of the way that this strategy was unique was, as Krista mentioned, the kind of buy-in strategy that we went about doing it. So as I mentioned, it started with really identifying what the problems we're facing in San Francisco. And it was a very robust conversation. There were things that were brought up in that conversation in terms of lack of trust in the IT department, understanding that we weren't doing enough with digital services and really improving the customer service experience, and thinking about alternatives of how do we actually address that going forward. And so ultimately what happened with that strategy was we wrote the city's technology strategy to say, here are the projects going forward. This is what we see over the next 5 years. And when it comes to the digital services strategy, we're just going to assign COIT or my program to flesh that out and go further and start to identify where that's going forward. And I just want to call it out because it's a very unique way to start talking about a new program that didn't include the mayor or the board of supervisors directly. Although we were working closely with the mayor's office throughout the entire time, COIT was put to kind of shepherd this conversation to go forward. And because we weren't going with elected oversight, it was a bottoms up kind of strategy building process. And so over the next 6 months, what we did is work very closely with our partner agencies. So like working with the Mayor's Office of Civic Innovation, which is where Krista was, the Data Office, 311, and Mayor's Office, and also the IT department. And we met weekly to talk about where we were, where do we need to go forward, and who to talk to. And we really tried to embody the values of what we did see as the digital services practices of what it brings in terms of human-centered design, really trying to bring up voices in terms of the program level and really trying to understand the problems. And we had a number of different kind of participatory workshops with leaders across the state or the city. And it was a long process. And at the end, we were able to make pretty clear recommendations. But I will say, I think building a strategy in this way is really the right thing to do, because ultimately, whenever you release a strategy like this that has very direct recommendations in terms of, we want to create a new city leader with resources to take over this, you're going to have status quo or other people pushing back. And we definitely felt that. But because of the way that we did it and made sure that we were really bringing in this buy-in into the story, we were actually able to overcome some of these very strident voices that did not want to, they had other ideas of what should happen. And so we were able to get this in the budget, and we were able to recruit Carrie, which we were so excited to get, and able to provide the resources and kind of get on a path where we had built in, I would say, network or like allies for Carrie when she came in to really help her move along and get things going. And not to say that Carrie didn't have a lot of challenges to deal with, but at least that we had a lot of progress there to socialize and really start thinking what we're trying to achieve and what we need to do to get there.
That's awesome. Thanks, Matthias. And I think I mean, I very vividly remember that the hiring of Carrie was like the biggest win I think we could have imagined for the outcome of that strategy. But Carrie, from your point of view, coming in after sort of this long process that the city had gone through, and in some ways it might have been helpful to say like, hey, here's your strategy. And in some ways it might have been like, hey, I'm here to lead this team. So what was your experience in arriving and sort of having some of that groundwork done? To what extent was it helpful? To what extent was it not? If you could just shed some light on that.
Yeah, I think it was incredibly helpful to have that done, because the nature of the strategy, and I saw that you shared the link in the chat. So like, for those that are curious, I guess it's what, 7 years old at this point. But like, I think it's still relevant, honestly, if not for San Francisco, like for government in general, because I think there's a lot that's in there that's, in some ways timeless, but also like our sector has not necessarily delivered on its promises at scale yet. So for places that are just thinking about starting this journey, I think it's still like a great kind of bookmark, to go off of. But with that said, I think the good thing about it was that it was like, it was a strategy in the sense that it said, the city needs to prioritize this work. It needs to create a team and a leadership role to carry it. And there are some basic principles of like, user-centered design and modern technology built in modern ways that should kind of underpin all of that. And so to that level, it was like actually very broad and gave a huge amount of space to then work out like, on the ground, what does that mean in terms of implementation? So at no point did I ever feel kind of constrained by that, but it was a very helpful like framing to be like, to the rest of the organization, like everybody agreed on this strategy and, this is it. The flip side of that, like, I think we therefore, and especially Matthias, but to your point about it being a very bottom-up approach to kind of strategy, I think there were some big conversations that kind of were a bit more top down in nature that sort of got missed and then ultimately kind of like blew up later on further down the line because they hadn't been addressed at the beginning. So, I think that nothing's perfect, right? And so I think in all cases, like it's probably the best start I could have had, because the essential framing that established like the legitimacy of the role in the team was very clearly contained within that document. So and within the context of the conversations that other people had around the city when I started.
Yeah, and I guess Sid, like 7 years later, you have this maybe sort of stale, but maybe still relevant document. Like, what is your thinking on to strategy or not to strategy in terms of how you're thinking about leading the team in this next era?
I'm generally a pretty big fan of strategy, but there are useful and unuseful ways to do it at different points in time and different stages. So having this strategy and having this many years of practice on top of it really puts me in an easy position in a lot of ways. I think a couple of other strategic decisions that maybe we're going to cover later, that the group is located in the city administrator's office, are really interesting, and that although there is kind of a level difference, it's still within a peer realm with the IT department. And that's been one of my big focuses, is kind of building that partnership for the future, with how do we at this point, with 5 years under our belt, moving up to 50 people, start to partner effectively with the groups that in the beginning, like Carrie really had to distinguish us from. And so I think looking, I don't refer to the strategy that much, but I can see the effects of it throughout, because people now understand that our team under Carrie built those vaccine sites and all of these critical things during the pandemic. And this month, we're going to complete moving a body of about 80 city websites onto this SF.gov platform, and it's going to be a lot more visible. A lot more to come and bigger ones. That's 80 out of, 211? But so rather than pointing at the strategy, I'm pointing at things we've done, but I can see how it's all informed by this past strategy, and that's very much in my mind. And then with the team, I know there's a few team members on the call. We've been working through this strategic exercise of, you know, we know a lot of what we're doing, but let's remember why we're doing it and what will mean it's a success and when we ought to course correct. So we've been going through the whole like internal strategy exercise of making bets on different important themes that we're going to work on in a very different strategy mode.
Yeah. And so Sid, you brought up something that I think is super important for sort of this broader conversation that I would love to get all of your perspectives on in different ways, but I'll start with you, Matthias, which is, I think this was a real kind of critical point in the development of the strategy and sort of the stakeholder process that we had. So how could you shed a little bit of light on how it was determined where the digital services team would live in the org structure? You know, as Sid mentioned, it was sort of how the strategy development was housed out of the city administrator's office. You know, Coit lived under the city administrator, but like, where did that, can you talk a little bit about that, those tricky waters that it was to get to that point around the home for the digital services team?
Yeah, tricky waters is definitely an understatement. This is probably one of the hardest questions, and part of the reason that I mean, government moves slow, but having long runways of being like very clear where you're going, like helped us address this very sensitive point. And so, I mean, like the reality was, when we started these conversations, the Department of Technology, the IT department, had positions that were meant to support the web and do digital services. They had, I think, like 26 positions, if I remember right. And so they saw that as part of their mandate. But that was part of the reason this whole conversation started. There was a lot of frustration that we weren't seeing progress, and that the IT department kind of had a number of different missions that it was trying to do, and we weren't really seeing progress on any of them because it was really spread out, and that this was really a space that needed to have dedicated time and resources. And that's what happened. And we had the leadership come together. A lot of them came from private sector or other organizations that said, you need to have a dedicated focus on this to be able to make progress and really change the customer service experience. So it was a long road to get to that conversation, but ultimately I think what swayed the day was, number one, it's the government's always about relationships. So we made sure it was very clear that like we're building towards a future and like we're bringing people along. It wasn't just us making a decision. But the IT department, I think what I kept on trying to push towards was more infrastructure focused. So more about the network, about telecommunications and some baseline applications around like O365 or Microsoft and the IT help desk, versus the digital services team, which is so closely related to program and service delivery that they needed to have a different relationship with departments that wasn't based in centralization. It was really thinking about what is the city's shared services strategy and what is this other kind of new model of thinking about really empowering other teams, this hub and spoke model of other departments to actually start improving, and how do you provide central guidance so that they can excel better. And that, I mean, honestly, that is still a conversation that is very much alive and not clear, especially now in my capacity in the state is just like, there are so many different voices. But I mean, I think that what I learned from this experience and the continue to work with Carrie over the years, I mean, like, I think the delivery, the impact that her team has been able to make, it speaks to itself. And I think that really when you just go down to the base level of like, has there been impact on program and service delivery, and how do people feel who all are working with it? Did it actually move forward? I don't see how it could have succeeded any other way. So I'm basically on a very strong side of not centralization into the IT department. I really think that the model that San Francisco brings forward is a best practice.
So Carrie, I mean, I actually asked the exact question or right question that I was thinking I was going to ask Carrie at this time. Like, how did you interface with the IT department? And to Gabe's question, what level of buy-in do you think you ultimately got or not from the IT department? And how did that look like? How did that look over time, or how did that change over time?
Yeah, and just before I answer that, I also I spotted another question in the chat, and I think it'll be really useful to answer that up front, because I think it sets a lot of the context for everything else we'll talk about for the rest of the call. So just real quick, and like everybody else jump in if I'm missing details here, but San Francisco is an incredibly federated organizational structure. There is no, like, no one's in charge, basically, if I were to be completely honest. And so while there is a mayor, and I will say as well that in San Francisco, while I was there for 5 years, in that time, there were 3 different mayors. So, you know, that too kind of, I think is like a side plot, but it also is like, kind of, it does have a bearing on how we related to kind of like the mayor's office as a whole. But even notwithstanding that, there are 57 different departments. There are 57 department heads. The city administrator oversees, you know, a collection of departments, and they range in size and kind of impact of about 30. But ultimately, there's no kind of like senior leadership team. There's no strong city manager. There's no strong mayor. I mean, I think the mayor of San Francisco, the current mayor, is very strong in her own right, but she has a very clear policy agenda, and it's like, it's pretty narrow, and it's certainly not concerned with like long-term organizational transformation. That's like, no mayor really has the kind of like the time to deliver on that. And it's certainly not really a vote winner. So in that sense, it's like pretty kind of, it means that we have like this super federated structure to play with. And there's pros and cons to that. I think, you know, to Matthias's kind of explanation of how the strategy came about, it's a lot of legwork interfacing all those different departments. And, you know, there are definitely moments of frustration with that, and where like you really just wish for that magic kind of top-down cascade. And then there are other moments where like it's actually great, because you get to work with like different departments on different footings, and you have some that are really like far out ahead of others, and you can really use them as demonstrators and kind of point everybody else toward like, hey, look what, you know, housing has done, for example, and kind of let that be the yardstick. So there are kind of different ways you operate within that structure, I guess, but I just wanted to kind of give the overview as to why like there might be some tension with the IT department and other organizations, that it's just like, you're working together, that's the end of it, or like this one's better than this one, that's the end of it. But in San Francisco, it's not like that. And just one other side note on that, sorry for the tangent, but I think one other feature of that, or is it a bug, is that like you end up with like, what really matters in San Francisco and other federated organizations is networks and relationships. And that matters way more than hierarchy. And that kind of like leading without authority is like probably the #1 skill that you need to kind of like be successful in that federated landscape, and in particular in San Francisco. And so that is also kind of like, it's good. If you're good at building networks and relationships, then that's awesome. But it also makes it very hard to have big impact early on. And I certainly found that, you know, I probably wasn't really accepted by the broader like community of departments, and probably until like year 3, when they were like, oh, I guess you're not leaving, so we'll take that meeting now. And so like they, you know, they kind of just expect you to turn over really quickly in roles like this. And so it was really a kind of a little bit of attrition that sort of like, when they realized, oh, you're still sending me emails, I guess you're a thing I should engage with, then that was like the moment where we kind of broke through. And I suppose that's kind of leads to then the question about the IT department, which is that like, you know, I think initially there was definitely some tension. You know, look, ultimately what happened was, as Matthias said, there was a team within the IT department that was already nominally doing this work. They were, you know, looking after the website, and they had just done a big web migration project, and it still sucked. And then there was like, you know, other people doing other pieces of the digital kind of puzzle and building digital services that were actually like pretty good, and are still kind of, I think we could still look at as good examples of what digital services in government really look like when they're run well. And so there was this kind of like, you know, I'm basically pulling out a bunch of people from the IT department, so they're losing positions, and I'm taking like some of the best people, you know, like brilliant engineers and like very hardworking PMs, and like people who, you know, are kind of like desperate to do something in the digital services realm, but weren't being given the space to do it. And I kind of just basically pulled them out of the IT department. So like, how would you feel about that? Like, pissed, I bet. And so that's kind of how they were, right? And so there was definitely a sort of early tension, I think, because I kind of stole some great people, and it was definitely seen in that way, you know. And so that competitiveness then kind of like, I think, emerged, right? It's like, a bit of territorial stuff. As Matthias said, I think as we kind of established, like, this is what the IT department is for, and actually you guys have your hands full with networks, communications, cybersecurity, like all these other pieces like enterprise apps. Like, there is a space here that we can work in, which is, more public facing, more business need led. And so that's kind of what happened. I will say, and credit to Sasha, who I think is on this call, that I think the best point of interface that we had with the IT department is largely due to Sasha's incredible skills. He would be horrified, I'm sure, if he had me call him diplomatic, but I think he was in that case. Those diplomacy skills really came to the forefront. And I think working with cybersecurity, where we really felt cybersecurity was, I knew you would be. We really prioritize cybersecurity as a team as well. So when we were thinking about what we were building, we were always thinking, what are the risks here and how can we kind of address them? I don't know if we always did a perfect job of it, but because we were always thinking about that, we were in regular conversation with the CISO, who was located in the IT department. And it helped that the CISO was also very forward thinking, as CISOs go. And so he is also a great champion of digital services. And so I think where those two sides met was where kind of magic then happened with the IT department. And I think because of the history of me and the founding of the team, the sort of the kind of beginning footing of the team where I was kind of taking people away, it's probably good that I'm not here now, and that Sid has a kind of a clearer, a kind of oh yeah, you can always blame it on the last person, you have that opportunity. And I think it's awesome. I hope you.
No, I think that's sort of hey, nice new sheriff in town, right? Right.
Yeah.
And I do let the CIO big sister me a little bit, just as a diplomatic, but it's okay. It works because, case study, right? We have this digital accessibility and inclusion standard that is very rigorous and very smart, and was put in place without any funding or plan for implementation. And so our team in the present is now faced with implementing it. And there's a bunch of people freaking out in the city right now because it basically gives a deadline for all city web properties to meet WCAG 2.0. One of the ways they can do that is they can come to the SF.gov platform. We're not currently resourced to bring the entire city to that by any stretch of the imagination, but we're figuring out, what can we do and how do we make an ask and how do we show the value of that? And so this first tranche of 80 is really going to help with that. But many of you may be in this situation. We're not just talking about moving websites on platforms. We're talking about transitioning people from .org and .com domains, of which there are tons, over to a .gov domain that really represents the city. Actually, that should probably be centralized in the IT department. So we're working with that group to collaborate on processes as we're trying to help resource a toolkit for people in the city who may choose to assess their own sites and then make a decision later about whether they're coming to sf.gov. The IT department has a lot of great knowledge in procurement, and they can buy large things. So they may be able to get an enterprise contract for one of the accessibility checkers, which, acknowledging they're imperfect, is a useful piece to provide as part of the toolkit. So we're collaborating along on that. There are a bunch of things like that where, as this really sort of, the funnel starts to widen out, right? There are small pilots and there are bigger pieces, and now there's this collection of 80 sites, and then going towards sort of, do we bring the city onto a unified platform? It starts to make sense to help bring some of those things to IT as a support for us and partner on how do we offer certain things citywide? How can digital services stay on the focus on user needs and innovating components that then can be reusable, that are very front end and very oriented around that customer experience, while some of the infrastructure, maybe at the domain level, maybe at the tooling level, maybe at some of these other things, can actually live back with IT with a closer partnership. Working all of that out, but I sort of want to bring the perspective from right now, building on all of that. That's kind of where we are.
Can I just jump in and just say, I'm so excited about what I'm hearing with the digital inclusion and accessibility standard. It's something that was a long time to get passed. And And I understand there's the resource issue of how do you implement it, but it's just very exciting because I think that's kind of what Carrie and I, when we started those conversations and talking about the evolution of strategy and digital services, of thinking about what is the organizational identity of San Francisco, which is very federated and not hierarchical in a lot of different ways, but how do you basically push for collective action and towards a single moment of really trying to improve services at scale? And that's exactly what that standard is intended to initiate, that type of action. It's a little cutthroat in San Francisco sometimes, where you're just like, no, we just have to pass this and get this done and we'll figure it out later. And that's ultimately what Sid is cleaning up right now. So thank you for your service.
Yes, although yes, we are facing apparently 2 or 3 really down budget cycles. So it's very interesting at the moment figuring all this out.
Yeah, but I think that's what I see. And it's just as a kind of like maturity growth of digital services team of really demonstrating and moving into the policy space more to really start doing organizational transformation. So it's very exciting to see where you're taking the team, Sid.
Yeah, and can you all, I mean, I would love to just dive into that a little more, like where you all see the role of policy versus kind of projects and just getting stuff done and showing value versus sort of having these standards and sort of the machinations that are involved in that. Like, where do you all sort of land on that balance of where to sort of prioritize your team's work?
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Sid.
No, I was going to say, I think that policy and practice kind of come together in platforms. And that's a strategy that Carrie had started before I arrived, and that I very much endorse and embrace, that there's a desirability piece because of all the federated nature of San Francisco that everybody's talked about. But if we make it easy and pretty desirable to be on these platforms that express the right things from the policy, that really is how we win long term. It's a difficult needle to thread. So, but there's so much grounding here already that really is what we're going after, is, we're building more pieces of things that are informed by the user research that our team is able to do, that then are just there for departments to adopt, that then are, that we actually measure and upgrade all at once. So taking much more of I drew a diagram for my team, and I don't have it with me, but we have a delivery group that helps people, like, and handholds them as they work through working with our platforms for the first time. And the long-term goal is kind of departments are autonomous with our platforms because they are the closest to their constituents. They understand the services that they provide. We help level up the capacity to increase that closeness with constituents. We also provide the general testing and components, but we also see long-term, hopefully, like little groups of people who do digital services explicitly. And, if you really want to get into things we're talking about, we're thinking about how do we start addressing the fact that IT doesn't have job classifications that cover, say, human-centered design. Now that it's been 5 years, can we really start to do that work and create some, which would make it accessible for many more departments to hire this kind of people, and have a team that can build digital services within certainly each large department that we can then kind of be a central convening body for, and holding as a service. Yeah. So that's kind of how I think about it, is that, yeah, policy and practice come together.
Yeah, Carrie, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think like from the outset, when I arrived, especially coming from Europe and different context around, I think the understanding of service design and like kind of cross-channel service design in government is much more mature in Europe than it is in the US for reasons. And I think that, so when I arrived, I was all like, doing all my go-sees and going to all the departments and being like, what are your problems? Tell me what you think about digital. And, people would be like, well, the website sucks. And I would be like, yeah, but it's not really about websites, it's about services and people and user needs and design thinking and like all this stuff. And they were just like, what the hell are you talking about? Have you seen the actual website? It's terrible. Like, this is like, you know, this theory, like all this stuff you're spouting just sounds like it's a world away from where we're at, which is literally like no one can find the button to do like the
There's
most.
a very United States gap here, which is about kind of government funding and government cuts at particular times. And so there was a rush of governments to the web in the late 90s. And then there was a little bit of funding to revise things in the early 2000s. And then with the Great Recession, there was a big period of time when not much was going on. And I don't know if that's different to what happened in Europe, but it definitely feels like part of why American governments at every level that I know of found themselves in the late 2010s going like, we don't even have basic websites that work all the time.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, yeah, we could have a whole nother session like unpacking some of that stuff. I think it's like, yeah. So anyway, to a nerd like me, it's super interesting, and I think to the four of you that I see, it's interesting. But I think in like so sort of in the San Francisco context, what that meant was like basically I couldn't really justify like anything I was talking about, because it all just seemed like kind of like airy fairy nonsense to people who were like trying to just, you know, post a PDF on the website, and it was so painful, and so they didn't do it, and then everything was out of date or late or whatever. And so, you know, essentially that kind of policy versus projects kind of like tension, or that kind of how do we sort of shape things and be the kind of like driver of things organization wide versus like how do we do projects, you know, for me I was like I've got no credibility if I can't deliver something. And so it really became about like what is the most important thing we could deliver, you know, as a team. And there were a couple of things that came up. Like one of them was right at that moment, cannabis, recreational cannabis had just been effectively legalized in San Francisco. So there was like a ready-made project there to work on around the permitting, licensing of cannabis businesses. And then simultaneously, then there was also this kind of website issue, and you know, how do we kind of think about essentially a web platform for city services in San Francisco, and not think about it, you know, and kind of model what great would look like. And so that's kind of how we ended up doing it. The other thing, and maybe Matthias can speak more to this than I can, but like funding for the team was still project-based. And that, you know, I think is like that's a fundamental problem with a lot of digital teams, and San Francisco is no exception. Like there is some basic funding there, but like, you know, if you want to grow the team, then you basically grow it by doing projects and asking for positions to deliver on those projects. And it kind of sucks, honestly. It's like a pretty bad way of like, it's great for like, you know, short-term growth, but it's not great for like long-term planning. And so
can you give an example? Can you be really tangible with that? Like what you did? Because I think this was actually a really big part of how you grew your team. Yeah. Like, could you just highlight like a couple of examples of where you did that?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest growth kind of inflection point for our team came when we took on permitting, for better and worse. And I can only apologize to Sid for what the mess that I left on around permitting, because I feel like it still wasn't tied up by the time I left. But regardless, like basically what happened was the deputy city administrator came to me and said, hey, I need your team's help. We're going to build a brand new physical permit center where people are going to come in person and get their permits. And this was great, very modern new place. And like previously there were like 12 different buildings and you had to run all over town and they were all terrible and you couldn't find anything. It was awful. They were building one-stop shop for all permitting. It was very luxury and like a lot of money going into it. And he was like, what should we have on the screens in the reception area? And I was like, that's what you want to engage digital services on? And so I was kind of like, well, I don't know, boss. Like, what experience do you want people to have when they come into this like shiny new building? Like you open the door to the permit center and what happens? And basically it turned out nobody could answer that question. No one had thought about the customer experience. They were just going to like shovel departments on the same floor and forget about it. And so I started like going to meetings and basically arguing like we have to come at this permit. So this physical space was totally out of my remit, by the way. I had like no authority to go telling people what to do in a physical building. I'm like the digital person, right? I had no right to be saying what I was saying, but I couldn't let it rest. And so, because if you know me, like I just wouldn't let it rest. And so I kind of just like started just knocking on all the doors being like, we have to think about this holistically. And in the end, what happened was they put someone in charge of owning like the customer experience of the permit center. And so we partnered together, and I was like, you know, really ultimately, yes, we do need a great customer experience, but wouldn't it be so cool if people could do the majority of this stuff online, or the admin, or the submitting of forms and all this kind of stuff, so you didn't have to basically come to the permit center and fill out physical pieces of paper while a bureaucrat watched you, which is what was planned. And so with that, we started the process of like, well, the question was like, well, how many people would you need to make that a reality? Now, I like vastly underestimated how many people it would take to make that a reality, because I also vastly underestimated just how messed up permitting is in San Francisco. But regardless, like I was like, I don't know, like 20 people. And like literally it was like, okay, you got it, 20 people. And so through some serious arm twisting and a lot of basically budget finagling, some money was kind of like taken from those permitting departments, given to me to build out, you know, a group of people who would work on permitting. And that's probably the most tangible example and the clearest example of how we grew the team, you know, and basically almost doubled in size within the space of a year.
So I wanted to follow on to that. So that's still something we negotiate with each budget, is how much money the various permitting departments in the permit center are giving us. On the other hand, we are continuing the work and moving along on it. And I thought Carrie might like to know that we are this close now to having our web form write directly to the legacy permitting system.
Can we all just do a collective cheer on this call?
How
happy that makes
and I think next week there's a kickoff for a follow-on permit center wayfinding project with our service designers that we are scoping really carefully, because there's still not that much clarity around what they want the customer experience to be, but it's become clearer and clearer. People get lost, they wander into areas where they're not supposed to be. There's a need for a holistic look at that, and because the team reputation that you built, people are interested in having us do it.
That's amazing. I hope Sasha's hearing this.
It's so great to hear things that are like, you know, we worked on like 3 or 4 years ago and it was such a struggle. Then you're like, oh, it happened. It's happening. Some things just take some time to percolate. I want to go back to Katie's question up above. Oh, no, I'm sorry. The training question, John's question around what our training is and sort of leading the agencies to better communicate with the public, and how do we sort of build that practice. And I'd love to invite Persis, who I know is on this call, to sort of jump in on how you are approaching that community of practice around sort of content and getting folks more equipped to be able to communicate in a human way.
Yeah, really slowly. We started off with the idea that we were going to try and get everyone writing in plain English and communicating directly to San Franciscans. And as a way of measuring that, we said you have to write to a 5th grade reading level. And of course, that is the only thing from any of those sentences that anyone takes away. So they know they have to write to a 5th grade reading level, and they know that's really hard. And there's a lot of usually swearing involved. But we can back it up with a lot of information on why, when we try and translate things that are above a 5th grade reading level, the translations get really bad. No, John, well, mine do, but I'm, unusual probably. But we run trainings on that, and it's been really great to watch people start to understand why they should be doing that, and to start to realize that actually writing at that really simple reading level would be better for them if they were reading a web page when they were stressed or whatever the situation is. And I think we trained, what, a couple of hundred people across the city at this point?
I think we had 190 editors active last month and considerably more than that trained.
Awesome. There's a great question here from Gabe on what were some of the team's kind of early wins, and were there any kind of aha moments for your government peers about the value that the team could offer? To sort of what were the moments where you sort of felt like you were building that trust and getting sort of more credibility and interesting opportunities? I guess I'll ask Carrie.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. I think that there were a couple where there were a couple of tests that came our way where I think the cannabis permitting thing was a bit of a test. Like, can you really deliver? Like, are you capable of this? And so I think that was really important, and we did a good job on that. Not in everybody's eyes, but in the eyes of the people that were, kind of testing us. So I think that was important. And then we also, there were already a couple of existing products that the team had built before I started that I think were also good examples that we were like able to point to. So that helped. And then our earliest wins with the website were really around like, there's Vanguard departments that wanted to participate. So the very small Office of Civic Engagement and Immigrant Affairs was pretty much the first department to work with us on sf.gov and kind of start putting content up there. And Persis did an awesome job in kind of putting her arm around that team and helping them learn how to write good content and getting them on board. And so then that was like our first department on the new website. That was huge. And so that I think was also like, those were some of the earliest wins there. The other thing we did was like, we deliberately decided not to make a big deal out of things. So, I think it was very tempting to be like, launching a new website, like let's have a big, let's do press releases and get the mayor to, press the button and do all that kind of shiny stuff. And we just didn't want to do that. We just wanted to actually like business as usual, like this is ready to go live, we're putting it live. And now like within the team, there was a cake and like there was some celebration around that because it was a huge moment for us. But we just switched out the main homepage of sf.gov and put the new URL live on like a Wednesday afternoon or something. I didn't really tell anyone we were going to do it. Like I got the approval I needed from the people who would be most worried about it. And then like, we just did it and didn't really announce it. And I think that also helped us a lot because we didn't have that sort of pressure of like the first thing to go live. So that was kind of a tactic, but I think it paid off in the end.
And if I can add on that, I mean, just from my perspective, going alongside Carrie, so she wasn't going for these public events like with the mayor or whatnot, but I do think that San Francisco has a little bit of a unique feature there, and it's not perfect, but in terms of socializing those wins with the other departments, we did have a budget process that's much more transparent in San Francisco than I've seen in other organizations, including the state, where just the annual budget process in terms of saying, these are the projects that we want to go forward with, and this is how much money, and this is our project plan. That's a very transparent process in San Francisco. We have a number of meetings that are actually public to talk about those proposals and chart a way forward. And it's intended to be able to provide additional perspective and hopefully set these technology projects in a way that are going to be more impactful. But really what Carrie was able to do to be part of those conversations is offer an alternative way of approaching technology projects. And so we were not just listen to the same old kind of waterfall legacy replacement kind of projects that are always coming through the budget process, but it started to actually have a different model and a different way of actually doing business that could just be part of that conversation. And what added a lot of impact, in my view, was that Carrie was inside the city. It wasn't some outside entity saying that, oh, you can do it this way. It was people who work inside doing it this way and getting results that helped build, again, those relationships and started to just call out like, oh, Carrie's someone that we can call up without any kind of like drama and just ask for her advice. And I think that's, I mean, like leading to DPH's involvement for the website is basically how it started. That they started to ask questions of like, what do you do? And then that led to the next thing and opened up another conversation. So I just call it out because I think San Francisco does have a separate fund for technology projects and a public process to do proposals that I desperately wish was at the state, but like the siloed environment is very standard that as far as I can tell in other governments, of departments are kind of doing their own thing, asking for their own funding and kind of competing for resources, and that kind of transparency and collaboration. There's a lot of value to do that. And it really helps bring in those other kind of perspectives of how to do things.
Collaboration sometimes. So there's a couple of really great questions in the chat that I'd love to have time for. One is Tegan's, which is, how are you identifying which departments go into which phases on SF.gov? Is it kind of volunteers, coalition of the willing, or do you have a certain set of criteria or like level that you want them to be at, or are you sort of bringing them, as he says, or as he or she says, dragging, kicking, and screaming?
We don't have a lot of dragging mechanisms. One that was available was that Drupal 7 was going to end of life, and a lot of the small like public commissions and so forth were on that platform. So that's a large portion of the 80 that are going to be completed in the next month. This digital accessibility and inclusion standard is, if not a method of dragging, it's a poke. That, you know, you need to get on here, but we're still looking at volunteers, and to some degree, honestly, we're looking at our platform maturity too. There are departments that have really complex functionality that's all built out that we are not yet supporting, and so we look at how we want to roadmap building those pieces into what we offer. And I think, you know, it's like if those 80 are about a third of the sites out there, as you start to get to that 40%, 50% milestone, it starts to seem kind of like what everybody's doing. And then you start to see pressures run a bit of a different direction. There are some departments that, you know, because we're a city and county, there's an airport. Probably if the airport stays on its own independent thing, that's okay. There's a couple of other things where it's really, you know, we will probably never get to 100%, but do we get to the 80, 90 that need to be on there? It's going to be a careful sequencing and road mapping of what they need and what they do, and making it more and more desirable. Honestly, we'll probably do some more design evolution just to, you know, help move that along too.
Awesome. And then Julia's question is sort of about the composition of the team, and in terms of size, skill sets, and full-time staff versus contractors. This is Julia from the city of Boston, who's curious, is building their team and wants to learn more.
I bet you know my friend Tiffany Chu. And I would love to talk more. So right now at full staffing, we are 50. That's across digital services and data SF, which is now part of our team. We're down about 13 people right now. And as we get towards the next budget cycle, it's going to look bad for us if we have vacancies. So we're on a hiring sprint through the end of the year to try and use up all those positions that people have offered us through various project agreements and so forth. We don't have any contractors. We are, though, as Carrie was describing on this, most of our staff are permanent exempt or project funded instead of being permanent civil service or funded by general fund as a permanent part of the city structure. So in theory, most of us are on 3 or 5 year project statements, and are easier to change than if we were permanent civil service. The engineering team is about 12 people. Content and design are each supposed to be 6 or 7. Content's down a few. Product is supposed to be about 5. They're down a few. And then we have this delivery group. that works closely with departments on some of the more complex stuff. We have a research group that's just moving to being 2 people soon, which is really exciting. And we have, at that size, we have a couple of folks who do administrative stuff, including myself and my deputy and, office manager. I actually think we're a little under-resourced in engineering per ideal, like with the number of designers and content folks we have, we do feel like our engineering department is a little under-resourced from what we would love, but we'll see if we can work that out through part of the next sets of cycles. But I also feel really privileged because a lot of teams are smaller and this team is incredibly capable and can do and has done great things in the structure that it sets.
Thanks, Sid. And I could talk with you 3 for hours. I hope to, but we are out of time. So just really want to thank the 3 of you and everyone who has joined for joining us, for asking such great questions. I hope this was really practical. I think what we're really trying to provide, real insights and resources and ideas for you all on this call. And so just a reminder that today's conversation, we're going to be summarizing it with some of the key takeaways and putting it up on digitalservicenetwork.org. We're also really excited about the launch of one of our sister projects at the Beck Center, the Digital Benefits Network Hub. There's an event on October 20th to learn more about that. We are also going to be hosting another session next month, all about user research in government, and sort of the practical elements of getting that done, from all the things related to compensation, recruiting, like really the nuts and bolts of some of the challenges and opportunities with user research in government. I think, Michaela's just put the event in the chat, so hope to see you there. And then please take a minute to join the DSN, the Digital Service Network. We're really kind of starting to build out our content and really trying to figure out how we can make this really useful and practical for you all. As someone who worked in government for 9 years before this, I'm trying to build something that I would have wanted when I was in government, which is like really actionable, practical things to help sort of accelerate the work that we're all in this doing. And then finally, we would love feedback. So we are, learning and growing. And so we'd love any feedback you have on the format and the content and all the things. So Michaela has just added that into the chat. Thank you, Michaela, my amazing colleague over at Beck. And thanks to all my colleagues at Beck who are our co-pilots in all of this. It's a really kind of fun and exciting partnership with them. So with that, I will say farewell to you all. Thank you. Have a great